Hello. Three things I want to do here. I want to relate this pressure volume loop of the heart to what you learned from skeletal muscle. And I also will go over this pressure volume loop. So that's the second thing that I'll go through. And then I'll go over the cardiac cycle and see how the cardiac cycle and the pressure volume loop show similar events in different ways. So first of all, let's go over what the changes for skeletal muscle looks like. So we have force over length. And what we have, first of all, is we have the total force that we had drawn. And then we have the preload, which is proportional to stretch, not directly due to stretch, so it's proportional. So in the skeletal muscle, what happens is you have the total force and you have the preload. These are basically calculated by isometric contractions. You take muscles at different lengths and you see how much preload is developed for the muscle at each of those independent lengths, and then you see how much total force is generated for each of those independent lengths. We have an afterload. Basically, you have an isometric contraction. The muscle does not change length, skeletal. Muscle doesn't change length. Then you have shortening. To that point, once that skeletal muscle hits that total force point, it cannot contract anymore. And it's basically goes this way, that way, and then it returns back to where it came from. So a weird kind of L. The heart is completely different. The total force is that top line, and the preload is that bottom line. And they're given different names, and we'll talk about that in lecture. The preload is basically based on the compliance of the heart, the ability of it to stretch. The total force is related to the contractility of the heart in general. So we've talked about the skeletal muscle. So in the heart, it's called pressure volume. The pressure is equal to the force. The length is now a volume. And typically, it's the end diastolic volume that's recorded on the x-axis, pressure on the y. So it's a pressure volume loop. And it's a loop because the heart actually forms a loop. So if we start at a specific end diastolic volume, a specific preload, okay, that's the volume that's filled the heart at that time. The heart starts to contract, goes up, isometric contraction to the afterload, right here, the afterload. Then the heart starts to eject all of the blood, and that volume of the heart changes, okay, and the heart stops contracting at that point right there, okay, so reach that total force line. Skeletal muscle will go back that direction, but the heart, it's ejected blood, so that volume is smaller, goes back down to this point, and then it begins to fill. So you can see diastole is in that orange dotted line. So diastole occurs in these two regions. Systole, the heart contracts. You have an isometric phase and an isotonic phase, okay, systole. As that heart starts to contract, okay, right at that point, that AV valve closes. That's the first heart sound, lub. You generate pressure, that atrial valve opens, and then the pressure goes all the way across, and then eventually the heart can't contract anymore. The ventricles can't contract, the ventricles start to relax, and that aortic valve closes, and then you come back down, an AV valve. So what you can see is that this area here, this low pressure area, is for the AV valve, and then the higher pressure area is for the aortic valves. So the opening of the AV valves is diagonally from the closing of the aortic valve. So you can use this graph, this loop, for pathology of the heart. What happens if the afterload changes? What happens if the contractility changes? What happens if the preload or compliance of the heart changes? If all of these things change, you see changes in this diagram. All different aspects of this diagram, you see different changes. You get changes in end diastolic volume, the volume that fills the heart. So you get change in the afterload, okay? And you get change in all of these different areas. If you have defects in valves, such as regurgitation, the shapes of these isovolumetric things can also change. And we'll talk about that in class. Now let's just look at the cardiac cycle, okay? Just for comparison. And we went over that in detail. So it's pressure over time. We have the atria, ventricle, and aorta. Basically, you have the first heart sound at the beginning, number 1, which is also diagonally from the second heart sound, the lub dub over here. In general, the higher pressures are the aortic valves, the lower pressures are the AV ventricles. So that's a similarity between the pressure volume loop. These are the aortic valves at the higher pressures and the AV valves at the lower pressures. Pressure volume loop doesn't have any time. The cardiac cycle doesn't really have any volume. So this way you can compare things together. Another thing for that cardiac cycle is when you have pathology, you have to look at the gaps in the pressures. So for example, if there's aortic stenosis, you're going to see that the ventricles will have a huge gap between the ventricular pressure and the aortic pressure. If you have atrial stenosis, you're going to have big gaps in between what is normal and above. So you can look at the gaps in between the different pressures. Okay, so you have pressure changes. And we'll also talk about that in class. So wanted to compare the skeletal muscle force length curve with that of the pressure volume loop for the heart. Wanted to briefly discuss different parts of the pressure volume loop in the heart, just to give an overview, and then compare it to the cardiac cycle, compare and contrast with the cardiac cycle.